This hearing is called to order. Good afternoon and welcome. Today's hearing is entitled The Emerging Space Environment, Operational, Technical, and Policy Challenges. I welcome each of the witnesses. Thank you for joining us here today. On October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union successfully launched Sputnik 1, the first satellite and man-made object in space. Slightly larger than a beach ball, and with barely more onboard technology than a beach ball, the satellite orbited the Earth every 98 minutes, emitting a beeping radio beacon that was picked up and rebroadcast in news reports all over the world. Although Sputnik would orbit the Earth for only 96 days, transmitting for only 21 of them, it was a pivotal moment in our nation's history that led to the ensuing space race, which put men on the moon and robotic rovers on distant planets. And it fundamentally changed the course of human history. It is fitting that this year, the 50th anniversary of the Apollo 11 mission that put those first men on the moon, we find ourselves deeply engaged in discussions about the future of space. From efforts to foster the growth of the commercial space sector to the return of American astronauts to the moon in the next few years, to the creation of a space force, the space domain is more active than ever. The next 50 years in space have the potential to be even more consequential than the last 50 years. But this will require a serious, sober look at the road ahead of us. As we look out over the space landscape today, what we see is far different from the landscape of 1969. America and the Soviet Union are no longer the only players in space. Government space programs are no longer the only game in town. And our technological capabilities, both in terms of our ability to plan missions and what we are able to put in space and for how long, are, for better and for worse, exponentially greater than they were when the space race began. No longer is space just an uninhabited void or a scientific novelty. From GPS and communication satellites to weather and imaging satellites, space has become an integral part of the world economy and of our everyday lives. It has become both the next frontier of exploration and of international commerce and economic growth. By some estimates, the space sector will grow to nearly $3 trillion in value in the next 3 decades alone. It is also my belief that the world's first trillionaire will be made in space. As commercial entities develop new capabilities for space, many of which were inconceivable even a few short years ago, and the government continues to leverage the commercial sector for launch services and exploration technology, the theoretical threats are becoming a reality. We have to forthrightly acknowledge that space has also become a domain of military competition. From the development and testing of anti-satellite missiles to the possible deployment of space-based weapon systems, the threats we face to our burgeoning commercial space sector, our civil space exploration efforts, and to our national defense are real. And it is long past time for the United States to act. Since the ancient Greeks first put to sea, nations have recognized the necessity of naval forces and maintaining a superior capability to protect waterborne travel and commerce from bad actors. Pirates threaten the open seas, and the same is possible in space. In this same way, I believe we too must now recognize the necessity of a space force to defend the nation and to protect space commerce and civil space exploration. As the United States looks to foster the commercialization of space, return to the moon, travel to Mars, and encourage burgeoning industries such as asteroid mining in which a small asteroid could contain rare materials such as platinum worth billions. A space force may well prove necessary to help provide certainty in ensuring that these efforts are successful, have longevity, and are not to be subjected to the whims of rogue or hostile nations. The importance of space to the United States will only increase in the coming years, and it is time that we recognize that reality and take concrete action to secure our supremacy in it. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today about what those steps might look like, how we might best coordinate our actions, and how we in Congress can act to ensure that the next 50 years and beyond are even more consequential and impactful than the last. I recognize the ranking member, Senator Sinema.
Well, thank you, Chairman Cruz, for holding this hearing. It's important that we develop thoughtful strategies and approaches to space that maintain the United States leadership and strengthen our country's security. I look forward to working closely with you on this and other issues in our committee's jurisdiction. Thank you to Administrator Bridenstine, Director O'Connell, Mr. Cardillo, Colonel Melroy, and Lieutenant General Thompson for joining us today. As you all know, space is important to U.S. communications, national security, and research and development. In my home state of Arizona, the space economy plays a particularly important and growing role. While Arizona is the fourth biggest state in aerospace and defense manufacturing, and Arizonans from universities and private industry across the state help our country lead in space. In order to protect America's status as the global space leader, we need thoughtful solutions to costly challenges, such as more congested space traffic, orbital collisions, increasing amounts of debris, and the growing risk of attacks on our assets in orbit. The first major collision in space occurred in 2009, when an inactive Russian satellite and an active U.S. commercial communication satellite collided, resulting in extensive debris that is still in orbit today. In addition to the potential for major collisions, we must account for the threat of space debris causing congestion and small-scale collisions. There are more than 23,000 pieces of orbital debris larger than 4 inches in Earth orbit. These include old satellites, disposable launch vehicles, and rogue parts. Even small pieces of debris can be problematic for satellites and the International Space Station. And beyond physical threats like collision and debris, other countries are working on technologies to interfere with and take down our satellites. These threats continue to evolve, and the U.S. needs to be prepared. We are making substantial investments in space with taxpayer dollars and sending new assets into orbit, but currently there are very few rules of the road. So although we have mechanisms that notify operators if there's going to be a collision, there are no rules that require operators to move. So we should find ways to address who has the responsibility and prevent collisions for both our assets and operators and for the international community. The United States should lead the way by setting unified standards for all operators in space, and we need clear strategies to prevent accidents and attacks on our satellites. We should remove safety and security issues so we can keep our assets in orbit and operational. And these threats will increase as space becomes more and more accessible. But by addressing these concerns now, we can turn our attention to emerging national security threats, continue our space development, and ensure that the United States remains the international leader in space. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I'll now introduce the witnesses. Our first witness is Mr. Jim Bridenstine, who is the current administrator of NASA. In his role at NASA, Administrator Bridenstine provides clarity to the agency's goals and aligns the strategic and policy direction of NASA with the interests and requirements of the agency's stakeholders and constituent groups. Prior to joining NASA, he represented Oklahoma's 1st Congressional District in the United States House of Representatives, where he served on the Armed Services and the Science, Space, and Technology Committees. Before joining Congress, Administrator Bridenstine was the Executive Director of the Tulsa Air and Space Museum and Planetarium, and before that served honorably as a fighter pilot in the United States Navy, where he flew combat missions in Iraq and Afghanistan. Administrator Bridenstine completed a triple major at Rice University and earned his MBA at Cornell University. Our second witness is Mr. Kevin O'Connell, who is currently the Director of the Office of Space Commerce at the Department of Commerce. Over the course of his career, Mr. O'Connell has garnered extensive experience in remote sensing commercialization operations, national security, and intelligence issues. He has extensive background in both the public and private sectors, previously serving as the chair of NOAA's Federal Advisory Committee on Remote Sensing and the Executive Secretary and Staff Director of the National Imagery and Mapping Agency. Additionally, Mr. O'Connell served as the CEO of Innovative Analytics and Training, focusing on market trends and analysis of geospatial technologies and cloud computing, and as the first director of the RAND Corporation's Intelligence Policy Center. He received his master's degree in public policy from the University of Maryland, College Park. Our third witness is Mr. Robert Cardillo, who recently retired after 4 years of service as the director of the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. While at the agency, Mr. Cardillo led 15,000 personnel, all deployed across 15 time zones, and initiated and implemented plans to leverage the burgeoning commercial entities in orbit around the Earth. Prior to that, Mr. Cardillo served in various roles in the intelligence community. While at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, Mr. Cardillo served as the Deputy Director for Intelligence Integration. He was also the Deputy Director at the Defense Intelligence Agency, where he managed a global network of 20,000 personnel to aid the U.S. military. Mr. Cardillo received a Bachelor's of Art from Cornell University and received his master's degree from Georgetown University. Our fourth witness is Lieutenant General David Thompson, who is the Vice Commander of the Air Force Space Command. As Vice Commander, Lieutenant General Thompson carries out Air Force space missions through the integration of space policy, guidance, coordination, and synchronization of space-related activities. He is also responsible for preparing mission-ready space forces and providing missile warning, navigation, and timing information to the North American Aerospace Defense Command. Lieutenant General Thompson received a Bachelor of Science degree in Aeronautical Engineering from the U.S. Air Force Academy. He also received a Master of Science degree in Aeronautics and Astronautics from Purdue University. And our final witness is Colonel Pam Melroy, who is the founder and CEO of Melroy and Hollett Technology Partners and a retired Air Force colonel. She spent over 25 years as an astronaut, serving as a pilot on 2 space shuttle missions and as the commander on STS-120, the second woman to serve as commander of a space shuttle. Previously, Colonel Melroy served as Deputy Director of the Tactical Technology Office at Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, otherwise known as DARPA. She also served 2 roles at the FAA, one as Senior Technical Advisor and Director of Field Operations for the FAA's Office of Commercial Space Transportation, and the other as Acting Deputy Associate Administrator of the FAA. Prior to that, she also worked as Deputy Program Manager of the Space Exploration Initiatives for Lockheed Martin. Colonel Melroy has a Bachelor's of Art degree in Physics and Astronomy from Wellesley College and a Master's of Science degree in Earth and Planetary Sciences from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. She also graduated in 1985 from undergraduate pilot training at Reese Air Force Base in Lubbock, Texas. Administrator Bridenstine, we'll start with your testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Cruz, Ranking Member Sinema, and members of the committee. It's an honor to be here representing 17,000 employees at NASA all across the United States of America. And I can tell you that we as an agency are very excited about our new direction to land the next man and the first woman on the south pole of the moon within 5 years. Given the title of this hearing, I thought I would talk about how NASA plays in our national security capabilities. We're very unique. There's a lot of people on this panel that are focused directly on national security. NASA plays in a different way. A lot of national security practitioners use an acronym we call DIME, and it identifies the different elements of national power: diplomatic power, information power, military power, which I think most people are very familiar with, and then economic power. So where does NASA play within the DIME philosophy? NASA, of course, is very strong on the diplomatic side. When we think about the International Space Station, for example, we have 15 different countries that operate the International Space Station on a daily basis. We have had 103 different countries actually do experiments on the International Space Station, and we have had astronauts from dozens of countries on the International Space Station. The International Space Station is absolutely a technological marvel, but even more so, it is a diplomatic marvel. Talk about something that would be very complicated to get all of the nations of the world behind. This was it. And yet it has been achieved by some of the most impressive spacefaring nations on the planet. So I think diplomatically, NASA plays a role there. When we talk about information, which is a piece of the DIME theory that I think a lot of people don't often think about, information is, we talk about Apollo 8. When our astronauts broadcast from the moon during that first moon orbiting mission, it was on Christmas Eve. And when they broadcast from the moon, 1 out of every 4 people on the planet heard or saw that broadcast, including tens of millions of people behind the Iron Curtain. That's an amazing information capability that NASA brings to bear, in fact, every day. Apollo 8 was December 24th, 1968. But since I've been the NASA administrator, I can give you example after example of things that have happened just in my time. In November of last year, we landed InSight on Mars. When we landed InSight on Mars to do scientific discovery and exploration, what we saw was that it was on the cover of every newspaper all around the world. That's an impressive information tool for our country. What does that mean? That means we have the ability as an agency to change the perceptions of young people all over the world towards the United States of America in a very positive way. So I think when you think about diplomacy, when you think about information, NASA plays very strong in those domains. On the military side, we intentionally make an effort not to get involved in military operations because we want to be able to have partners all over the world. We have, in fact, been partnering, interestingly, with Russia since 1975 with the Apollo-Soyuz program. The terrestrial disputes that exist seemingly fall away when we go into space. And I think that's a positive channel of communication for both of our nations. The last piece, economic, NASA does play. We have an intention of proving capability, proving technology, reducing risk, and then commercializing. And that's exactly what we're doing right now in low Earth orbit. We want to see commercial resupply of the International Space Station continue. We want to see commercial crew be successful. I think we can do that, in fact, this year, launch American astronauts on American rockets from American soil for the first time since the retirement of the space shuttle. But we also want to see commercial habitation in low Earth orbit. In other words, have the entire system of operations in low Earth orbit be commercialized. The question is why? Because then we can use the resources that are given to us by the taxpayer to do the things for which there is not yet a commercial industry. Retire risk there, namely in this case at the moon and then on to Mars, retire risk there with the intent to commercialize and move on. The chairman mentioned the idea of the ocean and how we ultimately have commerce on the ocean that needs to be protected. That's a naval theory that comes from somebody who I think is an impressive naval theorist in history, Alfred Thayer Mahan. And his concept was, if you're going to have commerce on the ocean, it needs to be protected. Well, we are in a place now where NASA is working really hard to help advance and develop commerce in space. And ultimately, what we are seeing, unfortunately, is that that is not always safe. And so I think it's important that we consider the risk to our civil agency, the risk to commercial industry, and consider ultimately how it can be protected. And that ultimately requires what we would see from the M in DIME, which is military support, which is ultimately what the U.S. Space Command is about and the U.S. Space Force is about. So while we don't play in the defense role, we don't play in the national security role specifically, we do have roles in diplomacy, in information, and in economics. And of course, we want to continue to have partnerships all over the world and let our military partners make sure that our operations are safe. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Bridenstine. Mr. O'Connell.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Sinema, and members of the subcommittee. I'm very pleased to testify before you today alongside my distinguished colleagues. For the last 10 months, I've run the office of the director. I've served as the director of the Office of Space Commerce within NOAA at the Department of Commerce. Our mandate there is to foster the economic conditions and technological developments for the U.S. commercial space industry. Today's hearing will inevitably cross many functional and organizational lines. My office was actually created 30 years ago when the idea of commercialization was purely a vision. But today we find ourselves at a key inflection point. A great number of entrepreneurs, encouraged by administration leadership, fast-moving technology, and enabling finance and insurance, are creating highly innovative capabilities in the market. They draw upon trends in standardization and reusability, and they leverage fast-breaking developments in artificial intelligence and cloud computing. The U.S. innovative spirit is alive and well. So let me emphasize that one of the contexts for today's discussion is that the future space operating environment will be overwhelmingly commercial. How much commercial? Again, the Chairman has already referred to this. Current forecasts indicate a global space economy between $1 and $3 trillion by 2040. At Commerce, we've actually spent a lot of time with the organizations that are making those forecasts to understand the drivers and impediments to that kind of economic growth. Whatever the number, the space economy will continue to have tremendous implications for our economic and national security. The reconstitution of the National Space Council has facilitated mission alignment across the executive branch by creating discussions on streamlining regulations on commercial space, SPD2, and space traffic management, or SPD3. What is also being pursued in parallel, however, is greater efficiency within our organizations. The administration has requested authority to elevate the Office of Space Commerce to a Bureau of Space Commerce, answering directly to the Secretary. Why? 3 ideas underpin this request. First, as a signal of the importance of the U.S. commercial space industry to our nation's future. Second, as a way of leveraging the many different commerce organizations in support of U.S. space commerce. And third, as a way of ensuring that economic and commercial views have equal representation in high-level executive branch discussions. One of the issues that we have started to look at Commerce is how to improve the role of the U.S. government agencies in the space economy. The U.S. government is still a very powerful actor in commercial space markets, yet the business models are changing. We're seeing a shift from the traditional U.S. government buyer-take-all to one where small, forward-leaning investments in the market stimulate demand and thereby help companies attract additional investment from the capital markets. This allows the government to explore specific use cases while providing critical resources toward commercialization. One other thing of note, while we're following the macro-level economic projections of the future space economy, we're also trying to enrich our understanding of space-related activities at the state and local levels in order to help guide government and commercial investment. The agencies represented at this table and others are working hard to encourage entrepreneurship and innovation. Agile regulatory and governance processes will be key to enabling the exciting developments discussed above and to make sure that the United States remains flag of choice for space entrepreneurs. Why is this so important? Historically, we argued about these issues in a vacuum. Today, however, we live in a world with competing international visions for the future of space and an increasingly competitive world. Collaboration will be essential between those countries who believe in innovation, genuine partnership, and free markets. At the end of June, the Department of Commerce, in collaboration with the Department of State, will co-host a Space Enterprise Summit here in Washington to discuss the changing nature of international cooperation and competition in space. And I hope that some of you will be able to join us for those discussions. Let me conclude my remarks by highlighting one other area of cross-government integration, SPD3 and the need to improve space situational awareness and space traffic management. The space congestion problem becomes more complex on a daily basis. As discussed before the Congress last year by General Hyten, Administrator Bridenstine, and Secretary Ross, the need to adjust organizational lines between the DoD and the Department of Commerce becomes more urgent. Commerce has moved out within existing authorities and resources on SPD3. For example, we're receiving responses to an RFI designed to canvass companies, whether those who will help mitigate the space debris problem with new sensors or visualization tools or cloud computing capabilities, as well as from current and future space operators who will create wholly new demands for SSA and STM services. The DoD-Commerce relationship has been exceptional. Our partnership allows DoD to focus on the more pressing mission of protecting U.S. space assets, including commercial assets, and protecting and defending the United States and its allies. But it is also based on the need to harness the innovation of the private sector and modernize our approaches to this urgent problem. We will have to make effective speed, not reckless speed, given the consequences. Why? SSA and STM does not just affect on-orbit safety, its economic effects trickle down through the entire space ecosystem. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Sinema, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for your interest today. As we continue to work through complex issues in the future space environment, let's not forget the extraordinary role that the private sector can play. Growing commercial success in space creates an economic foundation for our resiliency in space and underpins our national security and that of our allies. This is an exciting time to be in the space business, and there's a lot of work to be done here in furtherance of American prosperity and security. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Cardillo.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Sinema, thank you very much for this opportunity. I've had the pleasure of appearing in front of this and other committees for the past 3 decades, but as a federal government executive branch witness, this is my first time on the other side. But it is also a personal pleasure to appear with such distinguished colleagues on this panel. So just a little context about where I'm at. It's been 3 months since I left my position as the director of the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. It's been 36 years since I first raised my right hand and swore an oath to our flag and joined the profession of the intelligence community. I was fortunate to be introduced to a burgeoning imagery business, but at that time, 1983, it was a government-owned imagery business, and it had to be because of the necessity of protection of that technology and the capabilities that we uniquely had in space at that time. I was able to live through and help lead the agency through its movement from analog to digital, from going from only government-owned satellite systems to a commercial mix, and moving on from that virtual monopoly. As Kevin mentioned, in 1992, we had the Land Remote Sensing Policy Act, which introduced the first introduction of a remote sensing market. And the quote was that it should remain exclusively the function of the private sector. That's 27 years ago. The beginning of commercial licensing also occurred. I also experienced the fits and starts of PDD 23 in March 94. I worked for DCI Tenet in 2002 when he gave a directive to the intelligence community and directed that we should rely predominantly on commercial satellite imagery to the greatest extent possible. President Bush, NSPD 27, authorizing the commercial remote sensing space policy and maintaining our leadership all the way up to PPD 4 in 2010. Now, I became director of the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency in October of 2014, coincidentally 57 years after that Sputnik mission. The debate was, when I re-engaged with my teammates, it was how do we fully engage with this growing U.S. commercial marketplace? How do we take best advantage of this innovation that has been discussed by Administrator Bridenstine and Mr. O'Connell? And I challenged the agency at that time to find a way to succeed in the open, meaning we had a great past and a great history of providing classified and closed support, mainly to the military and to the intelligence communities, but we now had to find a way to take advantage of the more open technology. That created new partners, new vehicles, and new outcomes. And as much as I pushed when I was on the inside, in the very short period of time that I've had since leaving government, I've become even more excited about the possibility of such leverage. The monopoly is over, but the race is on. And I would agree with my colleagues that time is not on our side. I think there also is an analogy with what we went through in the digitization of the planet in the late 90s, the advent of the internet and the introduction of the World Wide Web. Literally, that world became digitized. I now think we have the opportunity. As a matter of fact, I believe we're on the cusp of making that physical reality of our planet the same type of digital reality. Whether it's for farming, fishing, construction, or insurance, one can imagine farmers getting precise crop precision prescriptions for their next yield. One can imagine traffic patterns being updated through predictive analytics vice the reactive analytics we get today. One can imagine insurance and credit flowing to markets that before the risk was too high for them to do, but I think we can now provide them with the insights to manage that risk and increase that investment. All to say to this committee that I think that as we and you can lower barriers to increase the entrepreneurial opportunities that have already been discussed, I think that we can sustain, if not grow, American leadership in space. And I'm sure that you'll share my confidence that should we play on even a near level playing field, I'd bet on the American ingenuity, the American innovation, and the values that we all swore to uphold. I look forward to your questions, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. General Thompson.
Chairman Cruz, Ranking Member Sinema, and distinguished members of the committee. I'm honored to appear before you today along with these exceptional space leaders, and I'm privileged to work with General Jay Raymond as his Vice Commander at Air Force Space Command. Today I represent on their behalf 26,000 men and women who remain the best in the world at developing, fielding, and operating space capabilities that serve our national leaders, our joint forces, allies and partners, and the global good. These capabilities ensure our armed forces have no equal and are a vital part of the commercial engine and civil society that remain the envy of the world. Today, there's unprecedented agreement among the nation's leaders that space has become a warfighting domain, just like air, land, sea, and cyberspace before it. Our national security and national defense strategies reflect this reality, emphasizing peace through strength and the need to maintain U.S. leadership and freedom of action in space. We are now dealing with the implications of that fact, driving tremendous change in order to maintain our leadership and the ability to operate in space under all conditions. Military, civil, and commercial space cooperation is a critical element of our efforts to organize, train, equip, and present space forces that will deter adversary action in space and, if necessary, fight and win in that domain. With my posture statement on the record, I'd like to begin with a few points. First, the Air Force recognizes that it's impossible to accomplish our space missions alone. We have a long-standing record of cooperation with civil, commercial, intelligence community, and other military organizations. We're committed to maintaining and strengthening those relationships and identifying new ones as well. For example, the Air Force and NASA have a long history of collaboration. John Glenn rode to space on an Air Force Atlas rocket. The Apollo Moon program, arguably the greatest scientific and technical achievement of the 20th century, was managed by an Air Force general, Sam Phillips. For years, the Space Shuttle and International Space Station have served as a test bed for DoD space-related research and experimentation. And today, NASA and the Air Force continue to work closely with a multitude of scientific, technical, and operational endeavors. But our relationship expands beyond NASA. We have a decades-long relationship with the Federal Aviation Administration in commercial space launch and with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration to provide space-based meteorological data supporting military operations and public safety. Recently, following the release of Space Policy Directive 3, Air Force Space Command has been working with the Department of Commerce on the transfer of space traffic management responsibility and other initiatives that support the nation's civil, commercial, and military space needs. And of course, our half-century relationship with the National Reconnaissance Office and other intelligence organizations is well documented. That relationship has never been stronger. Air Force Space Command has also made significant progress in expanding our commercial cooperation to enhance the national security space posture. These efforts include transfer of the commercial satellite communications provisioning responsibility from the Defense Information Systems Agency to Air Force Space Command, where we are already identifying innovative ways to provide commercial satellite communications to warfighters. We also established a Space Enterprise Consortium focused on teaming with small, non-traditional new space companies to increase our own agility, reduce costs, and accelerate development timeline for space capabilities. We're also teaming with DARPA and industry to assess the new low Earth orbit satellite architectures for a variety of space missions, and we're executing a space launch strategy that depends on a viable commercial capability to meet routine national security space launch needs. The Air Force and the Command will continue to foster our relationships with all of these organizations in all of the sectors with the goal of maintaining a robust and vibrant national security space enterprise. Congress has played a major role in ensuring that case in the past, and we look forward to your help in maintaining military, civil, and commercial space cooperation in the future. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, General. Colonel Melroy.
Thank you, Chairman Cruz, Ranking Member Sinema, the other members of the committee and your wonderful staff for inviting me here today. It's a real honor to be on this panel with my distinguished colleagues. So I'll get right to it. I consider that creating a thoughtful, whole-of-government space traffic management oversight capability is one of the most urgent tasks facing the government to support our needs across commercial, civil, and national security sectors. Currently, the DoD has statutory authority for collision assessment and notification. However, the number of sensors that they use is not sufficient to our growing needs. These sensors can be affected by weather. They only take periodic snapshots of the position of objects in space. Hours and sometimes even days go by without updates to orbital locations. Furthermore, we cannot reliably track debris 10 centimeters or less, and these objects present a hazard to navigation for all satellites, civil, commercial, and national security. Many of the new proposed commercial activities also include very dynamic operations, such as rendezvous, satellite servicing, and debris removal. Many emerging space threats are also highly dynamic. The ability to provide persistent custody of resident space objects is urgently needed for both the national security mission and also for a future civil space traffic management oversight authority. So one solution is to incorporate a greater number of sensors, potentially from commercial companies and private entities, to help fill those data gaps. However, commercial space surveillance data is actually still a nascent industry. The Air Force and a civil space traffic management oversight authority need to work together to give clarity so that industry can position itself to provide the products and services that the government needs. For example, the U.S. government needs to establish what data and how much data it needs to acquire in order to properly serve the community. Important work is still needed to establish the minimum threshold of service that the government should provide to all users, and how much data is necessary to provide that service. Additionally, a decision has to be made as to how and where that data will reside. If separate repositories are used for DoD and the civil authority, how does the government ensure that it's not paying twice for the same information? There are also implications for the intelligence community as we transition to a civil system. A system where open information about satellite positions is broadly available presents a challenge for conducting national security missions. The reality is that the IC is already facing this challenge, as an increasing number of independent domestic and international sensor operators come online. Any ability to remain undetected in space is tenuous at best. A potential approach parallels how sensitive missions in the national airspace are managed today. Currently, the FAA and DoD coordinate every day at local and national levels to protect information related to the presence of important assets operating in the national airspace. The existence of the assets is not disputed, but critical operational information is protected. These issues have a workable whole-of-government solution. However, until Congress takes action on the subject of who should oversee the civil space traffic management capability, the Air Force has no identifiable partner with statutory authority and the appropriate resources for coordination. We're already behind the curve. The need is urgent. A number of companies are actively seeking regulatory approval from other countries for these dynamic on-orbit activities. Other governments will be making decisions, setting precedents, defining by default what the global safety system will comprise. International regulations will be shaped by who leads, and without a civil authority, the U.S. is limited in its influence on space traffic management oversight outcomes to the detriment of commercial, civil, and national security. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss this important topic with you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much to each of the witnesses for your very helpful testimony. I have long said that I agree with the President and the administration on the need for the creation of a Space Force. Although I also have a standing request to the administration that I want to be notified the day that James Tiberius Kirk shows up to enlist. Administrator Bridenstine, you said if you're going to have commerce on the ocean, it needs to be protected, and the same is true in space. Do you believe that a Space Force is an important or even necessary component to ensuring that the partnerships we have with commercial space and NASA continue to prosper moving forward into the future?
I do, Chairman, and I will tell you I've been an advocate of the Space Force in my previous life in the House of Representatives. We voted on it, in fact, in the House. I was on the Strategic Forces Subcommittee. It got strong bipartisan support. Then I voted on it on the full Armed Services Committee. Again, it got very strong bipartisan support. I think of the 60-some members on the committee, only 2 voted against the underlying, or the National Defense Authorization Act that actually had the Space Force embedded in it. Then when we voted on it on the floor of the House, it got 344 votes. So it passed the House of Representatives with very strong bipartisan support, and of course, I supported it all along the way. I will tell you from my perspective, my new perspective as the NASA administrator, one of my biggest concerns is that the enemies of the United States see the destruction of space as part of their plans, should we end up in a war. And I think it's important that if we are to preserve space for exploration and discovery and science and all of the things that NASA does, we need to make sure that the enemies of the United States understand that there is no advantage to destroying space. They will gain no advantage over the United States of America from destroying space. And if we can not only signal that that's the case, but actually deliver on that, then they won't make those investments. And then we can continue to explore space together.
So in your judgment, how would a strong and robust Space Force benefit commercial space and space exploration? And in the converse, how would the absence of an effective Space Force harm commercial space and space exploration?
Sir, I think it goes straight to your opening statement about commerce. What NASA is attempting to do is develop space, especially right now, low Earth orbit, where we're having great success in the commercialization of space. So we are proving technology, we're retiring risk, and we're developing commercial markets. Now commercial industry is taking over a lot of those capabilities that NASA used to do exclusively. If commercial industry is going to continue to make those investments, and we're talking about big investments as you correctly identified, if they're going to continue to make those investments, they need to have assurances that their investments are going to be safe and protected. And I think that's ultimately why what NASA is doing is important for commercialization. What commercialization is doing is important for economic growth, but it's also important that it be protected. If we have that protection, we will continue to see growth. If we, conversely to your point, if we don't have that protection, we will not continue to see growth, and those investments will never be made.
General Thompson, in your judgment, how should the Space Force or Space Development Agency be designed to ensure that the Department of Defense is effectively capitalizing on the investments being made on the commercial space front?
Thank you, Senator Cruz. I would say a couple of things in that regard. First of all, when it comes to the Space Force itself, I think the proposal that was put forward by the Department of Defense is the best approach going forward for the Department and the nation for 2 reasons. First of all, it's effective because it takes the existing Department of Defense oversight and management structure. It creates a 4-star member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, an advocate for all of those capabilities, both in a warfighting sense and a development sense. But that Space Force is also efficient because it also capitalizes on the support and infrastructure and other capabilities the Air Force already has and provides for the majority of Space Forces today. When it comes to capitalizing on commercial investment, It also will consolidate, a Space Force would also consolidate all of those activities into one organization. Today, we have the Space and Missile Systems Center in Los Angeles that builds large-scale, incredibly capable assets for the nation, primarily from a military perspective. We recently established, with the help of Congress, the Space Rapid Capabilities Office to fill holes in the need to defend and protect those capabilities. And then the department recently created the Space Development Agency to specifically focus on and leverage commercial capabilities. Those organizations all need to work together. They can work together inside the current structure today, but a Space Force would help them organize and operate more effectively.
I very much agree with you that creating a separate Space Force, unifying the command, will elevate the focus on the theater, elevate the resources, the leadership, the focus on defending what is likely to be one of, if not the most contested theater going forward in decades going forward.
And Senator Cruz, if I may, also the fact that the President has already created a U.S. Space Command, a combatant command for space, I think helps in a great manner, too.
Absolutely. Okay, final question. As you know, Space Policy Directive 3 directs the Department of Commerce to be the focal point for civil and commercial space situational awareness and space traffic management efforts. And as the leading spacefaring nation in the world, we have a lot invested in our ability to safely conduct space operations and to track debris. And our needs in this area will only grow as space traffic and space commerce increase. Who exactly owns space traffic management, and who should own it? Whoever wants to.
Senator Cruz, if I may. So I would say in a de facto sense today, the Air Force owns space traffic management. And the reason is, as Senator Sinema stated, as an outcome of the collision between the Russian Cosmos and the Iridium satellite in 2009, no one else in the world could track these objects, could do the calculations required to determine whether they proposed or whether they were a threat to each other simply by their orbital motion. And so as an outcome of that event in 2009, the Air Force took on the responsibility because it was the only organization in the world that could. And perhaps today may still be the only organization, although there's a lot of great commercial and civil and other capability. The Air Force is an armed service. It is not a regulatory agency, so I would say that we will do this job as long as the nation and the world requires, but it is probably best suited for civil and other organizations in that regard.
But does anyone disagree or have a differing perspective?
I will tell you, Senator Cruz, I've in the House of Representatives, I took a position that the FAA, Office of Commercial Space Transportation, should have that role. I now see it quite differently. I think the Office of the Secretary of Commerce should have that role. And I say that because what we are trying to do is develop commerce in space. That's what we're trying to achieve here. And I think that if an agency that is responsible for developing commerce is also responsible for developing the rules by which people operate in space, I think ultimately it'll put us in a much better position in the future. I will also say that under all circumstances, it should not be the Department of Defense that does space situational awareness and space traffic management. That is a construct of the past, and it is certainly not going to work in the future. When I was in the House, we heard testimony after testimony from generals and admirals, Strategic Command, Air Force Space Command, and overwhelmingly they kept saying, we do not want to be the FAA for space anymore. There was a day when that was necessary. We're well past that day. It needs to be done by a civil sector, by a civil agency, and I think it can be largely, in my view, commercialized. So if the Commerce Department were to say, we can license private companies that can provide the data and the information, and then if somebody wants to launch into space, you have to prove to Commerce that you have SSA, Space Situational Awareness, and Space Traffic Management being provided by one of the commercial operators. That puts us in a position where there's opportunity to reform the system in the future. I get concerned when I hear people talk about creating a new government program for SSA and STM that won't have the ability to modify, it won't have the ability to change. In the 1950s, when we created the current air traffic management system, we used a network of radars and voice communication. I'm a Navy pilot by trade. In the 2000s, we were using a network of radars and voice communications. Technology has changed, but our system did not change. I think it's important that when we construct the next generation space traffic management system, it should have the ability to change. I think commercialization helps that, so that ultimately we have numerous providers that are competing on cost and innovation to get more data and better data for a safer space traffic management environment.
Thank you. Senator Sinema. Oh, Colonel Melroy, did you have something to add?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I do. I think there are pros and cons. The discussion is essentially Department of Commerce or Department of Transportation. The Department of Transportation, where I was at the Office of Commercial Space, was working very closely with the Air Force and has many people who have been thinking about this for a long time and actually ready to catch the football that they knew was coming at them. So they have the resources. They have the people who've been thinking about this. The other side of the coin is the administration has, in SBD 3, said Department of Commerce, and I think Administrator Bridenstine has made some really good points about why commerce is such an important place for that kind of civil oversight function. I think there are, arguably, you would say that the executive branch is in the best position to decide amongst themselves who they think the organization that is most willing and most prepared to take it on. So I think that's a very important thing. The problem is we have a third option here, and that's where we're at right now. We don't have anyone. And I would argue that's the worst option. So in my mind, I think there are pros and cons that are worth debating, but the important thing is that we need to get off the worst option and get onto one of the other two. And if there are issues and concerns, then they need to be addressed, but we need to move forward.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I think we stand at a moment where we're able to think about the disruption, if you will, of the space debris problem. And it's going to come largely through the good efforts that have been done historically by the Air Force, but increasingly by the developments in the commercial world. And as I said, there's a very interesting, diverse community of companies that are coming forward. You and I grew up in the age of satellite imagery when people were coming to market with 1-meter electro-optical systems. This is not that market. This is a market that is filled with radars and RF sensors and electro-optical telescopes, as well as a wide range of visualization tools that are completely different extensions of what we do today. And so the concept of space traffic management is in and of itself a bit outdated. What we're really trying to do is to improve the quality, speed, and accuracy of data to satellite operators so that they have a self-interest in knowing where they are and getting out of the way of people who might be in harm's way or collaborating with others. And so it's really a time to think about this in a fundamentally different way.
Thank you. Senator Sinema.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Following up on this conversation, these were really interesting discussions about commerce as an option. I'm interested in learning a little bit more about FAA as an option. So, Colonel Melroy, do you think the FAA would be a good or a poor choice to task with space traffic management? And if the FAA is a good option, would they also be responsible for tracking objects in space and preventing space collisions?
Senator, these are great questions. I think I'm going to go back and remind everyone that there are pros and cons on both sides, right? There is something to be said for having all the oversight concentrated in one place. And Commerce currently has other regulatory oversight with regards to Earth observation and imaging. And having a concentration in a single place, I think, that definitely has some benefits from a regulatory perspective. Unfortunately, right now, the FAA has the people who've been thinking about this for a while and actually have been embedded in the community and understand it. In fact, when I was at the FAA, I hired an employee to sit in the then JSPOC, now CSPOC, to begin to absorb the lessons that would be needed to be learned going forward. I think either way, there are going to have to be some adjustments that get made, whether the Department of Transportation or the Department of Commerce takes over oversight. These are issues that do have to be addressed. But I have full confidence in this committee that you can absorb this information that we're sharing with you about some of the pros and cons and make sure that the legislation appropriately deals with that.
Thank you. My next set of questions are for Administrator Bridenstine. Orbital debris, as we've talked about, is an increasing problem that can potentially interfere with civil, military, and commercial space operations. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the efforts to update the U.S. orbital debris mitigation standard practices, and how will the U.S. work with the international community on adoption of standards around debris mitigation?
Yes, ma'am. So NASA is part of what we call the Interagency Space Debris Coordination Committee. And what this is all the different space agencies in the world that have the preponderance of assets in space. And this group of space agencies has done modeling and made a determination that the type of collision, I think it was you that referenced it in your testimony, the Iridium Cosmos collision from 2009.
Right.
That type of collision is going to happen on average every 5 to 9 years, and that's if launch cadences stay the same. Launch cadences are not going to stay the same, and every time we launch something into orbit, there will, by default, there will be some level of debris created. We as an agency work very hard on making sure we mitigate as much as possible those debris-creating events, and then also ultimately helping set the standard. As you identified, we set a standard that then our commercial partners follow, and then commercial industry at large follows those standards. And then eventually those standards get accepted as norms of behavior in the international community, and then our international partners follow suit. So we have, as an agency, been leading on this for a very long period of time. And we need to continue leading. We need to make sure that when we move forward on all the activities, like I said, launch cadence is going to stay the same. That's what the study said. If it stays the same, we're going to have a collision every 5 to 9 years. It's not going to stay there. We're talking about launching thousands and thousands of satellites into low Earth orbit for low latency, high throughput communications. In other words, we need to get really good at debris mitigation. We also need to get really good at situational awareness. We need more data and better data. We need that data to be shared, and we need people to be able to respond to that information in real time. We need a single integrated space picture. So I will tell you, this is something we at NASA we're thinking about all the time. We're one agency of many that deal with this, but certainly we are keenly aware of the issue and trying to do everything we can to mitigate it.
So a follow-up question. It sounds like if NASA understands the increased risk, because as more traffic goes into space, then there'll be more debris.
Yes,
So
ma'am.
the mitigation work makes a lot of sense. What, if anything, can be done about removal of debris that exists already?
So that's the next order of challenge. So there's the mitigation, which preventing it from happening, and then ultimately then there's the situational awareness and traffic management piece, and then finally there's the remediation. How do we remove orbital debris? So in this case, the Federal Communication Commission actually has authority to write the rules for geostationary orbit. So if a satellite comes to the end of its useful life, they have requirements for it to be super synced. In other words, put into deep space for storage. In other words, it's a dead satellite. We got to get it out of the way. In low Earth orbit, there's other agencies in this case that have jurisdiction that say that we have to deorbit satellites in low Earth orbit. So those are remediation capabilities. Then there's the challenge of the debris that exists, and how do we get that removed? So what NASA is doing right now is we're investing in technologies, namely robotic servicing of satellites, robotic technologies, rendezvous and proximity operations, in order to, no kidding, come in close proximity with other satellites and then robotically service those satellites. So we can actually extend the life of a satellite so the satellite does not become orbital debris, and maybe eventually, depending on resources, we could actually grapple satellites and take dead objects out of orbit altogether, larger objects. The challenge is anything that we're going to do in that capacity is going to be something that we can see. We're talking about objects that are larger than 10 centimeters.
Right.
I will tell you, Ranking Member, I am not worried about the objects we can see. I'm worried about, for every object we can see, there are 10 to 100 objects that are smaller than 10 centimeters in diameter that ultimately are traveling at 17,500 miles per hour and every bit as dangerous as an object that's 10 centimeters. So I'm more worried about what we can't see. And that's why we have to increase the network of sensors around the world. It's why we have to improve the data that we receive and how we process that data.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to all of our witnesses today, and thank you, Chairman, for holding this hearing. I yield back.
Senator Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of our witnesses. Fascinating topic, and appreciate your insight. I want to follow up a little bit on the space debris, but before I do that, Mr. Bridenstine, I wanted to ask you a question. As you know, we're approaching the 50th anniversary of humanity's giant leap and the Apollo landing, something I know that you are particularly passionate about as well. And last week we had Jeff Bezos unveil a new moon lander. There's numerous public and private missions that have been planned for the lunar surface as well. I know NASA has issued guidance for the protection of the human heritage site of the Apollo 11 landing. I'm working on legislation now to codify that, but I would like your thoughts. Would you support enacting statutory protections to preserve and honor the Apollo landing sites on the moon?
Senator, yes, sir. It needs to be protected. There's going to come a day when we have humans living and working on the moon, and that will be a monument for all of history. So yes, sir. I believe we should be protecting it.
Great. Well, I appreciate that, and then I would assume you'll be working with some of your counterparts with other countries that may be going to the moon as well to make sure that we all can agree that this is a human heritage site that we should protect.
I think there's broad agreement on that.
Great. Back to the orbital debris, which is clearly a significant problem, as all of you have articulated. I'd like to hear the panel's thoughts on the Kessler effect, which I believe it's a scenario where space junk crashes into satellites and then it creates even more debris, and then there's basically a ever continuing chain reaction that eventually spins out of control. Some think we may be in a slow motion effect like that right now. Are you aware of or have any accurate estimates of the probability of this kind of chain reaction, and what are the estimates of it? Have any of you done any work in that area? Because we may already be down that path right now, but as you mentioned, Mr. Bridenstine, this is going to accelerate. It'll likely be an exponential acceleration, and with this kind of effect, be very difficult to control.
Senator, I'd just like to comment. I think the technical issues that Administrator Bridenstine brought up about objects less than 10 centimeters really, really important. DARPA did a study called Catcher's Mitt, which said that the other thing that could be done is that there are some few dozen very large objects. They're actually upper stages that have been left in orbit. And they are the most massive objects. And so they have the greatest potential to create a huge amount of debris. So there are policy issues that we have not discussed around third-party liability. The key one being if you go to grab a hold of a piece of debris and, oops, something doesn't go well, more debris is generated.
Right.
There's a liability issue associated with that. One of the opportunities I think that the U.S. has to show leadership on this topic is to accept that the U.S. has liability under the Outer Space Treaty and go and clean up our upper stages, or at least a handful of them. It would have a huge impact on preventing something like the Kessler syndrome. The other comment that I would make about the Kessler syndrome is our Earth is astounding in its ability to heal itself. And eventually, if we follow debris mitigation standards, eventually objects in low Earth orbit will get flushed in and re-enter and burn up in the atmosphere, we think. And so there's the potential, if we are mitigating, if we clean up the worst and the largest objects, that there's hope that the Kessler syndrome won't come to pass.
Right. Thank you. Mr. Brightside?
Sir, I would say the Kessler syndrome is something we think about. It's something that we need to prevent from happening. We're not there yet, but given the amount of activity that we see coming with these massive constellations of communication satellites launching into low Earth orbit, it's something we need to be very aware of, and we need to do everything we can to prevent it from happening.
Thank you. One final question, Mr. Bridenstine. Clearly, investments in space power our manufacturing, our aerospace industries. You've all highlighted the importance of space exploration and space commercial activities. It's certainly why I'm a big supporter of the SLS, the Orion programs. But while I support these programs, I think it's also very important that NASA focuses on its science budget and its important science mission, which has always been a core part of NASA. And that's why I'm concerned about the new directive to rapidly speed up our mission to the moon as to what that can mean for the overall science budget. So Administrator, if you could just assure us that NASA will not sacrifice the scientific investments to fund these kinds of exploration activities, that still remains a core mission and one that we're going to continue to fully support?
Yes, sir. And I can tell you, I'm very proud of the fact when the President and the Vice President gave us direction, we need to accelerate the path to the moon. I made it very clear what works and what doesn't work because this has been tried before in history. The Space Exploration Initiative back in the 1990s, the vision for space exploration in the early 2000s. In each case, the effort was made to achieve the end state by cannibalizing one part of NASA to feed another part of NASA. I made the case very strongly that we should not be working towards this goal by cannibalizing the Science Mission Directorate, nor by cannibalizing the International Space Station. And the $1.6 billion that we have for now going to the moon does not come from any part of NASA. It comes from outside of NASA. It was the case that I made when they said we wanted to accelerate, and we were successful in achieving that.
And how confident are you that $1.6 billion is enough?
So it is enough for 2020. It gets us out of the gate very strongly. It helps us ultimately continue with SLS, which I know you're very keen on. It is also a necessary piece to getting a lander. So we are currently building Gateway, which is in orbit around the moon, which will be in orbit around the moon. We need to aggregate at the Gateway a landing system, and this $1.6 billion, the majority of it goes towards procuring that landing system. A lot of that money was to be spent in 25, 26, 27, and 28. We've now moved that up so that when we launch our first humans to the Gateway in 2024, they will actually have a lander already aggregated at the Gateway by which our next man and first woman will have access to the surface of the moon.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, a few more questions. Mr. Cardillo, a large part of the discussion surrounding the creation of the Space Force is what role the intelligence community should play given its diverse equities. What is your view on the role that the intelligence community should have in the Space Force, and specifically should NRO, NGA, and others be included in the Space Force from the beginning?
So first, to answer the role question, I think it's quite analogous to the role we've played in other domains. We're statutory, I say we, NGA is statutory responsible for providing safety of navigation wherever it occurs, whether that be land, sea, or air today. I would extend that argument to the space domain, and we've actually worked with the Air Force in the past about how that will happen. Not on a traffic management perspective, which has already been discussed, but more about safe operations and secure operations, because besides debris, there's digital and cyber activities, which also could pose a threat to our operating environment. To the second question about what should be in and what should be out, I'm a big proponent of transferring knowledge, experience, and expertise, but I don't believe transferring agencies such as NGA or NRO now into an entity such as the Space Force would make any more sense than it would have taken the NGA that does maritime safety and transitioned that to the Navy. I think the nation is well served by the consolidation of that expertise that can be applied across different domains. I would say the same things about my former colleagues at the NRO, who have got 60 years of expertise with launching and operating satellites. I think that too can be transferred without moving the organization itself.
All right, let's talk a different area. Let's talk about leadership. Last month, Ms. Champlain, the Managing Director of Acquisition and Sourcing at the Government Accountability Office, testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee on the Space Force proposal, stating, quote, "It appears that there will be a number of space acquisition activities outside the Space Force, including the Missile Defense Agency, the NRO, and some military space service activities. But so far it is uncertain what the overall governance structure for space will be. If there are conflicts in requirements, funding, or priorities between agencies that are not in the Space Force, who resolves them and makes a final decision? In your minds, Mr. Cardillo and General Thompson both, where should the interagency dialogues on disputes and solutions live?"
It's an excellent question. Whenever somebody says it's an excellent question, it means it's a hard question. But let me enjoy my former government status now and just say that, look, I'm a big supporter of the re-emergence and the energy that's been put into the Space Council. Conversations that occurred at lower levels in the past have now been highlighted and elevated, and I think the nation's better served by that. I would offer that could be an avenue to answer your question about differences or equities that might cross lines, or where good patriotic Americans from one agency would disagree about the best path forward. That response, by the way, has not been coordinated with the Space Council as to whether or not they would accept said adjudication, but I guess I'm just saying I like the momentum that we've got now. I think those conversations are elevated. I think the adjudication of that answer, the complexity of it, I think should at least be originated there at the council, and how and where they designate it, for lead to do the adjudication, I think is work to be done.
Senator, I agree with Mr. Cardillo in many cases. One of the reasons this debate started 2 or so years ago was because there were so many organizations who had some role in space, and I'll say specifically national security space, although as Administrator Bridenstine said, there are many aspects to space. One of the arguments was there were far too many organizations and people involved in national security space alone. In fact, at one point, I believe the comment was there are 60 or so organizations. And so the conversation that started here in Congress, that was taken up by the President, it's now made this a kitchen table conversation. Since that began, we've actually created some more space organizations. And so in a sense, we're making that coordination more complicated. I believe it's now time to start consolidating some of those, and I believe absolutely the Space Force is one of the ways that can bring some of those disparate organizations that exist today, bring a focus, bring an organizational structure on top of it, so that that one organization, at least when it comes to the National Security Space Organization, can carry the advocacy, can make the decisions, and perform an integrating role with the rest of the interagency, the way we do in many other ways today.
Okay, last set of questions is addressed to all the witnesses. Morgan Stanley reported last November that, quote, "The revenue generated by the global space industry may increase to $1.1 trillion or more by 2040. The development of reusable rockets and greater use of broadband technologies in orbits are a couple of examples of the contributing factors to the potential economic growth." The report goes on to say that a U.S. Space Command could, quote, "benefit aerospace companies and help, quote, focus and accelerate investment in innovative technologies and capabilities." In the judgment of the witnesses on the panel, to what degree do you believe a strong U.S. military presence in space will contribute to a thriving economy in low Earth orbit?
Senator? Mr. Chairman, thank you. I'm firmly of the belief that a strong military presence will very much encourage the growth that we've talked about already in this hearing and in the Morgan Stanley projections already. As we've looked at that, as I mentioned in my testimony, we've looked at where the calculations are coming from for those estimates going forward. And the simple breakdown of that is that if I simply take the functions that are being performed on Earth today and extend them to the population that doesn't have, the half of the population that doesn't, for example, broadband communications, high-speed communications, and internet, you get to $1 trillion quickly. A modest 5% growth off the $400 billion economy we see today over the next 20 years, you get beyond the $1 trillion. Where the additional calculations come from have to do with the things that will go on in space and will then affect both things on Earth and the exploration goals that the nation rightly has. I will cut it another way for you, which is that we see the functions that were traditionally commercial functions, remote sensing, communications, weather. We see companies coming forward in the market every single day at Commerce that are going to disrupt those business models. At the same time as companies will come forward with new ideas that are going to change the landscape of exploration, things that we do on the moon and Mars and beyond. And so there's both of those camps. Those can only benefit from a robust U.S. military presence in space, similar to the naval examples that we've talked about today.
I would just add a bit to what the administrator said earlier about your question about risk. I firmly believe that the fundamentals of this American experiment really haven't changed, that investors have to quantify the amount of risk versus potential reward. To the extent that entities such as Space Command or Space Force or better traffic management or increased understanding and awareness can reduce the first component, the second will rise. We will get more investment. Our system works that way. And that's why I, again, believe in putting the bet on us is the right one to do. So anything that reduces that uncertainty, I think, will increase the opportunity for future investment. And let's face it, that's been our system for over 200 years, and I think it'll serve us well going forward as long as we reduce unnecessary barriers and increase the, as I said, that broad-based information to make those bets.
Well articulated, Mr.
Chairman, I would double down on your statement earlier today. You mentioned that you believe the world's first trillionaire is going to be somebody who is exploring space. That was actually the result of a study done by Goldman Sachs, and they indicated that that would be the case. So the question is, we talk about rare earth metals, and what a lot of people don't realize is that rare earth metals are not earth metals at all. They're asteroid impacts, in many cases from billions of years ago. And it just so happens that these asteroids in deep space have a tremendous amount of very valuable metals in them. Right now, NASA is doing a mission at an asteroid in deep space called Bennu. So we have entered orbit around this asteroid in deep space, and in fact, we're going to actually do, for the first time in the history of the world, a return from Bennu with a sample. So this little robot is going to go down, grab a sample from Bennu, and bring it home. And there's a reason to do this. Number one, we want to be able to characterize these asteroids in deep space so that we can protect the Earth, quite frankly. The evidence is in the dinosaurs did not have a space program. We do. So we want to be able to characterize any kind of threat that might be out there. But the other thing that's important is we're going to be able to get really good information about what these asteroids are composed of. We have another mission that's going out to the asteroid belt, and there's an object out there that is a massive steel ball. And I have to hesitate, I don't want to say how big it is, but it's a really big steel ball. If the NASA administrator gives a stat that's incorrect, I get corrected immediately all over the world. But this big steel ball, it is potentially a planetary core from the past in the asteroid belt, and people have suggested that it's worth, if you could bring it back to Earth, it would be worth more than the GDP of the United States of America because of all of the precious metals that are there. So we want to go characterize that through the Psyche mission that we're developing right now. So there's a lot of reasons that it's important to protect space. There's a lot we don't yet know and a lot that we're researching, and I do believe that when we make these discoveries, there's going to be an entrepreneurial effort to go forth and do amazing things, just like back when people came to the New World.
So the ship that you have at the deep space asteroid, is it being piloted by Bruce Willis?
Yes. If you think that will help, we'll do it.
Senator Cantwell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for this important hearing. And, you know, when I hear these expectations and opportunities in space, obviously I think of the companies in our state, SpaceX and Blue Origin, and now, I don't know if it's fair to say trillionaires when these guys are already billionaires, but hopefully it'll be a more impacting event with many, many different products and avenues for people to pursue. I wanted to ask you, Mr. Bridenstine, about weather forecasting and 5G and the degradation that some spectrum sales could have on our weather forecasting. I think I heard that you had some similar concerns maybe in front of another committee, but my colleague, Senator Wyden, and I have sent a letter to the head of the FCC asking for them to make sure that we're not impacting what would be the 24 gigahertz band that would impact that vital information. So do you think that that is possible to give us basically by which band we're talking about and access to impact our weather forecasting?
That's, I think, an important question. I would answer it this way. The 24 gigahertz band is critically important for our ability to characterize the amount of water vapor in the atmosphere. NASA is sensing the Earth in every part of the electromagnetic spectrum all the time. 24 gigahertz gives us the opportunity to characterize the amount, the quantity, and the energy state of the water vapor in the atmosphere. And that ultimately is what helps us make determinations as far as weather prediction. Now, NASA does not do weather prediction. We build satellites for NOAA in the Commerce Department so that they can do the operational weather prediction. But there is a risk that if we do not have access to that spectrum, that our weather forecasting could be degraded. We are working right now with the FCC to kind of work through a solution, and that is underway right now, but this is of concern to us, and certainly...
What kind of degradation? Are you talking about in time and information?
Yes, so we talk about weather forecasts in terms of a 7-day weather forecast. So if instead of getting all of the data we are currently getting, if it degrades to a certain percentage, the less data we're able to glean from that part of the spectrum, the more degraded our weather forecasts get. So if we lose, and I don't know what the specific numbers are, but if we lose, say, 50% of the data, then maybe instead of 7-day weather forecast, we would get a 3 or 4 day weather forecast. So these are the kind of impacts that we're trying to work through and understand and work with the FCC in order to mitigate what those impacts would be through this spectrum sale.
Well, the reason why I'm bringing this up, Mr. Chairman, is it does have a connection to our very subject this morning. How do you do space launch if you don't know weather forecasting?
No, we agree. I'll let the Department of Commerce talk about this.
Sure. Thank you. We would echo entirely the comments made by the administrator here, concerns about a deep reduction in quality of our Earth observations for weather prediction and things like that. And so whenever we have these spectrum auctions of any kind, we really need to be very careful. At times I worry that we think that there is a one-to-one comparison for the impacts in the terrestrial world as there are in space. And in fact, they're not. I mean, when you're working in space, you have a slightly different scientific buffer that you need. And when you're going to beam back capabilities from 4 billion miles away, I don't have the ability to chop up that spectrum in as small a chunk as you would typically on the ground. And so wherever these spectrum decisions are being made, we have to be very sensitive to the impacts on the space community, and then, Senator, as you suggest, its impacts on things we're going to do in space from Earth.
Well, the reason why my colleague from the Northwest, Senator Wyden, and I sent this letter is because I can tell you people of the Pacific Northwest know what storms are all about, and we know what hot, dry seasons are doing to us as it relates to fire. And so we need the weather forecasting, and we need it in advance. We don't need it 3 days out, 2 days out. We need it to know where and how to get the resources to the location. So we're very concerned, and we hope the FCC will stop their process until they can assure us that this weather forecasting information is going to be available because of the impacts of weather on our communities and safety. But we also see just in this panel and discussion how much in the previous hearing we had last week, the advent of how many launches we're talking about now with various capabilities, that we need to be able to plan those launches and to plan those launches and launch windows that get delicate on their own right, There's complexities to those launches. They need to know what their weather windows are going to be. So it seems to me that whatever the FCC is doing over there is not paying enough attention to this very important issue as it relates to both the safety and security of our citizens and having good weather forecasting data. And we're working very hard on this because we've always worked hard on this because we've had some shadow issues with Doppler systems and things that have prevented us. Either we had 2 back-to-back 100-year floods that we lost life, and after that, NOAA decided, yes, you need a Doppler system for the coast because you're not getting accurate information. And then we've had an impact on loss of life of firefighters because they were sent out when we didn't fully understand wind conditions that were clearly seen in Seattle but not seen in the central part of the state, again, because they didn't have the kind of visibility. So we're for, particularly now, that every particle in a storm can be an algorithm. We are all for having that data and information and calculating it to make us better prepared. And I certainly would want it for our space missions as well. I would want them to have the certainty and assurity that we're going to be able to understand the launch windows and not wreak havoc with everybody related to the launch, not just in the space industry, but commercial travel and everything else that goes with that, because we don't have a picture of what the weather conditions are because we sold the spectrum all to somebody else. So I hope that we can clear this up and get an answer from Ajit Pai and the FCC.
Well, if it would be all right if I could just comment, because we think what you're saying is very important, and we want to make sure that we're doing the right thing by our country. A couple of things. When we talk about where NASA and NOAA, where we play, is in that 23.6 gigahertz spectrum. The auction, of course, is 24 gigahertz. So it's not the exact spectrum where we operate. That 23.6 gigahertz is not determined. It's not like we can go to a different part of the spectrum. It's set by physics. We are sensing passively the energy state of water molecules in the atmosphere. Now, that is set by physics. We can't just go to a different part of the spectrum. Now, here's the thing. In that 24 gigahertz spectrum that is auctioned, I think it's important to note that if the decibel level is low enough, then it won't bleed into that 23.6 gigahertz where we are operating and sensing the Earth for weather forecasting and Earth science and climate. So I think there could be an elegant solution here, and certainly we are paying very close attention to it. But the decibel level is really what matters here. And if that decibel level is too high, then it will impact us. If it's not too high, it won't impact.
Well, interference are always the issues in spectrum, always. And so I just think it's too important. All of these things are too important for the public in commerce and everything else, the applications that all this is going to allow to get this right. So I hope that we can get it right. Thank you, Mr.
Yes,
Chairman.
ma'am.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
And Administrator Bridenstine, you testified about physics a minute ago. I was told there'd be no math at this hearing. So I want to thank each of the witnesses for your very helpful and learned testimony. I think this was a productive hearing, and I appreciate the time and energy you put into the testimony. The hearing record will remain open for 2 weeks. During this time, senators are asked to submit any questions for the record, and upon receipt, the witnesses are requested to submit your written answers to the subcommittee as soon as possible. And with that, the hearing is adjourned.